All right, so we're back at it here. And there is one thing I wanted to talk about right here. Truthful and noble. And then I want to get to 6 and 7. Especially in 7 is where we really start to get into Nietzsche's understanding of how the word good came to mean herd mentality, more or less. But the truthful. So truth is one of these things where you think, oh, truth and honesty, that's good, that's virtuous, that's ethical, and all that kind of stuff. And the idea here he's talking about in paragraph 5 is it's actually just the opposite, because truthful, the reason we call the noble truthful is not because they don't want to be dishonest. It's not out of a sense of virtue. It's because they were powerful enough to not have to lie. The idea is when you lie to people more powerful than you because you are trying to escape the consequences. But when you are noble, you don't care what people think because you're powerful enough to have your own, sense of truth. So it's interesting. There's, one avenue where we get a sense of, good and ethics actually means something totally different than we think. Now, check out number 6. He starts talking about the priestly caste. And by caste, think like class or something. And in here, he starts with the idea that the priests were the clean ones, right? The ones who are pure, right? Pure of heart, less sinning, all that. But it starts with literally washing their hands. So the priest class, and why is he talking about the priest class? Because, well, actually, let's check out the first line of this one. It's important. He says, above all, there is no exception, though there are opportunities for exceptions, to this rule that the idea of political superiority always resolves itself into the idea of psychological superiority in those cases where the highest case is at the same time the priestly case, and in accordance with this general characteristic confers on itself the privilege of a title which alludes specifically to its priestly functions. In these cases, for instance, that clean and unclean confront each other for the first time as badges of class distinction. Here again there develops a good and a bad in the sense which has ceased to be merely social, etc., etc. The point he's trying to make. So one of the things about the aristocratic, noble class was their liking for war. So they're a warfaring class of people. And indeed, if you think about it, it's generally the rich, powerful owners who start wars, not the people who actually fight them, right? And so what happens over time is there is as societies grow in wealth and whatnot, priests become a more important part of the culture. So in Rome, it was the same thing. And in medieval Europe, the same thing. That eventually the Catholic Church sort of like civilized a lot of these knights and aristocratic types. And literally it was about being clean. Literally, you had to wash the blood off your hands before you went into a church. It used to be, for instance, in Rome, going into the city of Rome, you could not have on your armor. And to enter the forum, you had to be clean of all dirt and blood. So over time, what that means is it literally was initially about being pure of hands, right? But eventually that comes to mean pure of spirit. And that over time means that these priestly people are able to sort of assume or assert themselves over the aristocratic. Okay, well, let's spend some time on number 7, okay? It's really the whole crux. This is where the priestly class is able to sort of assert a bit of a herd dominance over the powerful noble class. The reader will have surmised with what ease the priestly mode of valuation can branch off from the knightly artistic mode, aristocratic mode, and then develop into the very antithesis of the latter. Special impetus is given to this opposition by every occasion when the castes of the priests and warriors confront each other with mutual jealousy that cannot agree over the prize. The knightly aristocratic values are based on a careful cult of the physical, on a flowering, rich, even effervescing healthiness that goes considerably beyond what is necessary for maintaining life, on war, adventure, the chase, the dance, the tourney, on everything, in fact, which is contained in a strong, free, and joyous action. The priestly aristocratic mode of valuation is, as we've seen, based on other hypotheses. It's bad enough for this class when it's a question of war, yet the priests are, as is notorious, the worst enemies. Why? Because they are the weakest. Their weakness causes their hate to expand into a monstrous and sinister shape, a shape which is most crafty and most poisonous. The really great haters in the history of the world have always been priests, who are also the cleverest haters. In comparison with the cleverness of priestly revenge, every other piece of cleverness is practically negligible. Now, when he's talking about priests, so here's kind of where he's going. Think about this for a second. When you think priest, you might think Catholic Church, but it's a word that means like any, magistrate of any religion. So it could be a rabbi, an imam, a minister, whatever, pharaohs. No, not pharaohs. What were the priests called in ancient Egypt? I don't know, whatever, but you get the point. Okay, human history would be too fatuous for anything were it not for the cleverness imported into it by the weak. Take at once the most important instance. All the world's efforts against the aristocrats, the mighty, the masters, the holders of power, are negligible in comparison with what has been accomplished against those classes by the Jews. The Jews, that priestly nation which eventually realized that the one method of effecting satisfaction on its enemies and tyrants was by means of a radical transvaluation of values, which was at the same time an act of cleverest revenge. Okay, now he's not being anti-Semitic here. He's not just picking on Jews because he's racist. What he's saying, and this is the whole history of things, and he gets into this in the next couple of paragraphs, is that it was the Jewish faith that first came up with a monotheistic God. Granted, there are cults of Osiris and Ra in Egypt, which maybe could be sort of monotheistic. But the biggest one was the Jewish faith. So it was the Jewish faith that thought about God as one God, a monotheistic God, but also that God could not be depicted in anything. In other words, it was a transcendent God. It wasn't a God of big muscles like the Egyptians had or the Greeks, right? Think of the Greek gods, Zeus and Apollo, and they're big, strong people, right? That, fight and all this kind of stuff. The Jewish God was not a big, strong person. It was a totally different concept of God as not to be seen physically in life. Okay, that's what the Jewish people brought. And the Christians also had the same concept of God, right? So Christ is a human being, God made man, but still God himself, just like the Jewish God, is not something physical and imminent, right? Okay. Where did I leave? Oh yeah. Yet the method was only appropriate to a nation of priests, to a nation of the most jealously nursed priestly revengefulness. It was the Jews who, in opposition to the aristocratic equation that good equals aristocratic equals beautiful equals happy equals loved by the gods, dared with a terrifying logic to suggest the contrary equation, and indeed to maintain with teeth the most profound hatred, the hatred of weakness. This contrary equation, namely, the wretched are alone the good, the poor, the weak, the lowly are alone the good, the suffering, the needy, the sick, the loathsome are the only ones who are pious, the only ones who are blessed. For them alone is salvation. But you, on the other hand, you aristocrats, you men of power, are all eternity, the evil, the horrible, the covetous, the insatiate, the godless. Eternally also shall you be unblessed, the cursed, the damned. Okay. So where he's going with this, right? And then the last line talks about the revolt of the slaves. So, and he's laying it on thick here, right? Like we said, it's poetic, but again, try not to think of him as being like just racist. What he's saying is with the Jewish people came a whole new way of thinking, because Moses, right, was the most important figure about pulling together Jewish principles and Jewish law based on their religion, right? So based on the understanding of God. So you get the Ten Commandments, all that kind of stuff. But if you recall, when Moses was around, the Jewish people were enslaved by the Egyptians, right? So the Egyptians were the masters, the holders of power, that kind of thing. And so literally, the Jewish, wasn't born, the Jewish faith and value system was consolidated through Moses at a time when they were slaves. And so, of course, if you ask slaves, what does good look like? They're going to basically look at their captors and say, it looks like the opposite of that, right? And that's what Nietzsche is saying. And then eventually when Christ comes, right? And so think of the Sermon on the Mount. Happy are the poor in spirit, happy are the poor, happy are the meek, that kind of stuff. When you think about it seriously, and don't get angry, but from a perspective, it's like happy are the losers. Happy are the not successful, right? Happy are the poor. So when you think about it, there's a flipping of valuation so that strength and power and beauty and all that kind of stuff is not the important things. In fact, it's actually the meek, right? Like Christ was helping out lepers and that kind of thing, not the beautiful, right? Hanging around with tax collectors, prostitutes, that kind of thing. So that's what Nietzsche is saying. And so, wait, where are we? Yeah, here. So there's a certain revenge, and you look at number 8 here, and the idea becomes that this sense of resentment is systematized into a value system through the priests. So the priests sort of mine, in a way, that anger and that resentment. And this is what they say. Instead of saying, hey, yeah, we're going to put an army, attack you and get our revenge, their revenge, because they're too weak to actually do physical revenge in the temporal space in history. Instead, their revenge is a religious one. So they say, oh yeah, you might be able to enslave us, but you're going to go to hell. And God loves us. So we're going to put up with this shitty life right now. Whoops, sorry, I said a bad word. We're going to put up with this life right now because we're going to get squared away in the afterlife. So in the afterlife, God will win. That's why Nietzsche calls this priestly valuation a valuation of resentment, because it is fueled by resentment. And so the priests are very wise in being able to turn their anger and their resentment into power. Literally, it's turned into power over the aristocrats, but through religious signification rather than physical. And he says right here at 10, the revolt of the slaves and morals begins in the very principle of resentment, becoming creative and giving birth to values. A resentment experienced by creatures who, deprived as they are of proper outlet of action, are forced to find their compensation in an imaginary revenge. While every aristocratic morality springs from a triumphant affirmation of its own demands, the slave morality says no, from the very outset, to what is outside itself, different from itself and not itself. And this no is a creative deed. The volte-face of the valuing standpoint, this inevitable gravitation to the objective instead of back to the subjective, is typical of resentment. The slave morality requires, as the condition of its existence, an external and objective world. To employ physiological terminology, it requires objective stimuli to be capable of action at all. In other words, what is he talking about? You need people who are being screwed over physically in this world, right? You need the real stimuli so that people are fearful and angry. They're not going to be fearful and angry merely abstractly. But you can turn the fear and anger into abstraction. Okay, let's continue. Its action is fundamentally a reaction. The contrary is the case we come to the aristocrat's system of values. It acts and grows spontaneously. It merely seeks its antithesis in order to pronounce a more grateful and exultant yes to its own self. Its negative conception, low, vulgar, bad, is merely a pale, late-born foil in comparison with its positive and fundamental conception, saturated as it is with life and passion of we aristocrats, we good ones, we beautiful ones, we happy ones. Okay, so the point is, with a transcendent God that you can't see, that's not going to start an army for us, the first real priestly class in the Jewish faith begins this process of turning good from successful to weak, thereby completely turning ethics on its head, right? And the idea is that the noble class doesn't even go around looking for a conception of itself. It believes that what it creates is good. So to the noble class, whatever they do is good. It's the underclass, the herd mentality, that is always seeking some kind of affirmation. And when they feel a sense of injustice, then they point back to the people who are the source of injustice and call them bad and evil. And so it's almost as if, whatever side we're on, good is whatever makes our current reality easier. And for those who are oppressed, to vilify the oppressors is what makes it easier. And for those who are not, those who are oppressors, what's easier is to say that what you're doing is good. That's where Nietzsche's going. That's why you have these two completely different and antithetical value systems. Okay, there's one last little thing I want to look at, and then I think, that's probably good for Nietzsche. I think maybe you're getting the point here.